Number, the general drenched her, so she took him down in a single strike. Colonel Sarah Martinez had always known that respect in the military had to be earned, not given. After 15 years of dedicated service, countless deployments, and a spotless record, she thought she had finally earned her place among the top brass. She was wrong. The morning started like any other at Fort Harrison. Sarah arrived at headquarters before dawn, her uniform pristine, her boots polished to a mirror shine. She had been selected to present the quarterly intelligence briefing to the Joint Chiefs, a responsibility that would determine her next promotion. This was her moment to prove that she deserved to be considered for the position of Brigadier General. General William Blackwood was known throughout the military as a man who demanded perfection. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. A decorated war hero, with 3 decades of service, multiple combat tours, and zero tolerance for what he called military mediocrity. Sarah had studied every detail of his career, knowing that impressing him would be crucial for her advancement. The briefing room was filled with high-ranking officers when Sarah entered. She had prepared for weeks, memorizing every statistic, every strategic detail, every possible question that might arise. Her presentation materials were organized flawlessly, her charts and graphs color-coded and cross-referenced. She had even practiced her delivery multiple times in front of a mirror, ensuring her voice would project confidence and authority. As she began her presentation, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes situations. She spoke clearly about troop movements, intelligence-gathering operations, and strategic recommendations for the upcoming fiscal year. Her data was solid, her analysis was thorough, and her recommendations were backed by extensive research and field experience. For the first 20 minutes, everything went perfectly. The other officers nodded approvingly at her insights, and even General Blackwood seemed engaged, leaning forward in his chair and taking notes. Sarah began to feel confident that she was making the impression she needed to secure her promotion. Then disaster struck in the most unexpected way possible. As Sarah reached for her water glass during a brief pause in her presentation, her hand trembled slightly from nerves. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, sending water splashing across the polished conference room tiles. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent room like a gunshot. Every eye in the room turned to the mess at Sarah's feet. She immediately bent down to begin cleaning up the broken glass and water, apologizing profusely for the disruption. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment as she tried to gather the larger pieces of glass while using napkins to soak up the spreading puddle. General Blackwood's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Colonel Martinez, step away from that mess immediately." Sarah straightened up, confused by the sharp tone in his voice. She had expected perhaps a gentle reprimand or maybe even understanding accidents happen to everyone, even in the military. What she didn't expect was what happened next. "In my 30 years of service," General Blackwood announced, loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, "I have never seen such a display of incompetence from a senior officer. If you cannot handle a simple glass of water, how can we trust you to handle classified intelligence operations?" The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She stood frozen, her mind reeling from the unexpected attack. Around the room, she could see the uncomfortable expressions on the faces of her colleagues. Some looked down at their papers, others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but none spoke up in her defense. But General Blackwood wasn't finished. What happened next would burn itself into Sarah's memory forever, and change the course of both their careers. "Since you seem to have difficulty maintaining basic military bearing," the general continued, his voice growing louder and more contemptuous with each word, "perhaps you need a reminder of what it means to be truly soaked." Before Sarah could react or even comprehend what was happening, General Blackwood picked up the large pitcher of ice water that had been placed on the conference table for the meeting attendees. Without warning, without hesitation, and without any regard for military protocol or basic human dignity, he dumped the entire contents over Sarah's head. The shock of the ice-cold water hitting her was nothing compared to the shock of the violation itself. Water cascaded down her face, soaking through her carefully pressed uniform, dripping onto her polished shoes, and creating a new puddle on the floor around her feet. Her hair, which had been pulled back in a regulation bun, now hung in wet strands around her face. The room fell into a silence so complete that the only sound was the steady drip of water falling from Sarah's uniform to the floor. Every person in that room, seasoned military officers who had seen combat, who had witnessed the horrors of war, who had endured the most extreme conditions imaginable, sat in stunned disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Sarah stood there, water still dripping from her chin, her uniform clinging uncomfortably to her body, her carefully prepared presentation materials scattered and forgotten on the floor. The humiliation was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment she couldn't even process what had happened to her. General Blackwood returned the empty pitcher to the table with a satisfied thud. "Clean yourself up, Colonel," he said dismissively. "And perhaps next time, you'll remember that precision and attention to detail are not suggestions in my command. They are requirements." The other officers in the room remained silent, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and discomfort. No one moved to help Sarah or to challenge what had just occurred. The unspoken rule of military hierarchy meant that questioning a superior officer's actions, even actions as clearly inappropriate as these, was not something most were willing to risk. Sarah wiped the water from her eyes and looked around the room at the faces of men and women she had served alongside, people she had considered colleagues, and even friends. The silence spoke volumes about the culture she had dedicated her life to serving, and about the reality of what it meant to be a woman seeking advancement in a system that seemed designed to keep her in her place. "Yes, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She gathered what remained of her dignity, picked up her soggy presentation materials, and walked toward the door with as much composure as she could muster. As she reached for the door handle, General Blackwood's voice followed her one final time. "Colonel Martinez, you are dismissed from this briefing. I'll be submitting a report about today's incident to your commanding officer. I trust this will serve as a valuable learning experience about maintaining proper military standards." Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the handle, water still dripping from her hair onto the floor. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside her. The humiliation began to transform into something else entirely, a cold, focused determination that would drive everything she did from that moment forward. She turned back to face General Blackwood, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the incident began. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying a quiet strength that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Thank you for the lesson, General. I won't forget it." As Sarah left the briefing room, closing the door quietly behind her, she had no way of knowing that those words would prove to be more prophetic than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. The lesson she had learned that day was not the one General Blackwood had intended to teach, and the consequences of his actions would reach far beyond anything he could have anticipated. Walking down the corridor toward her office, her wet shoes squeaking against the polished floor, Sarah began to formulate a plan. She had always been a strategic thinker, someone who could analyze complex situations and find solutions that others missed. Now, she would apply those same skills to a very different kind of mission. One that would require patience, precision, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The water would eventually dry, her uniform could be cleaned and pressed, and her hair could be properly arranged again. But the memory of what had happened in that room would remain forever, serving as fuel for what was about to become the most important mission of her military career. The investigation begins. 3 months had passed since the briefing room incident, and Colonel Sarah Martinez had thrown herself into her work with an intensity that impressed even her most demanding supervisors. On the surface, she appeared to have moved past the humiliation, focusing on her duties with renewed dedication and professionalism. But beneath her composed exterior, Sarah was methodically building what would become the most comprehensive investigation of military misconduct in Fort Harrison's history. Sarah had spent those 3 months doing something that few people knew she was uniquely qualified to do. conducting investigations. Before her current assignment, she had served for 2 years with the Military Criminal Investigative Organization, where she had learned the intricate art of building airtight cases against corrupt officials. She understood how to gather evidence, how to protect sources, and most importantly, how to remain completely invisible while doing it. Her first step had been to establish whether General Blackwood's treatment of her was an isolated incident or part of a pattern of behavior. Using her security clearance and her position in intelligence, Sarah began carefully reviewing personnel files, incident reports, and transfer requests that had crossed the general's desk over the past 5 years. What she discovered was far worse than she had initially suspected. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Female officers under Blackwood's command had an unusually high rate of requesting transfers to other units. Exit interviews, when they existed at all, contained carefully worded complaints about hostile work environment and unprofessional conduct from senior leadership. Several promising female officers had mysteriously received negative performance evaluations after years of stellar reviews, effectively ending their chances for promotion. Sarah discovered that she wasn't the first woman to be publicly humiliated by General Blackwood. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Chen had been forced to do push-ups in front of the entire mess hall after supposedly showing disrespect by asking a clarifying question during a briefing. Major Jennifer Walsh had been assigned to clean the base latrines for a week after her uniform allegedly didn't meet standards, despite passing inspection by 3 other officers that same morning. Captain Lisa Rodriguez had been screamed at for 20 minutes in front of her subordinates for submitting a report that was supposedly unreadable, even though the same report had been praised by every other officer who reviewed it. Each incident had been carefully documented in official reports that made the punishments seem reasonable and justified. Blackwood was too smart to leave obvious evidence of his discrimination. He understood how to work within the system, how to use military protocol and hierarchy to mask his abuse of power. But Sarah also understood the system, and she knew how to use it against him. The breakthrough came when Sarah made contact with former Captain Maria Santos, who had left the military entirely after serving under General Blackwood's command. Maria had been one of the most promising young officers in her class, with commendations for bravery and leadership that suggested she was destined for high command. Instead, she now worked as a civilian contractor, her military career destroyed by what she described as systematic harassment and discrimination. Maria agreed to meet Sarah at a small coffee shop 30 miles from the base, far enough away to ensure they wouldn't be seen by anyone from Fort Harrison. The conversation that followed provided Sarah with the final piece of evidence she needed to understand the full scope of Blackwood's misconduct. He called it stress testing. Maria explained, stirring her coffee nervously as she spoke. He said that female officers needed to prove they could handle pressure before they could be trusted with real responsibility. But it wasn't stress testing. It was torture designed to break us down and force us out. Maria described incidents that were even worse than what Sarah had experienced. Female officers being assigned impossible tasks with unrealistic deadlines, then being publicly berated when they inevitably failed to meet the arbitrary standards. Women being excluded from important briefings and training sessions, then criticized for not having information they had never been given. Most disturbing of all, Maria revealed that Blackwood had created an unofficial evaluation system where he would rate female officers on their physical appearance and use those ratings to determine their assignments and opportunities for advancement. I tried to report it, Maria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I went through proper channels, filed formal complaints, even tried to speak directly with his superior officers. But Blackwood had been building relationships and covering his tracks for years. Every complaint was dismissed as personality conflicts or failure to adapt to military culture. They made me feel like I was the problem, like I was too weak to handle the demands of military service. Sarah listened to every word, taking careful mental notes while maintaining the appearance of a casual conversation between old friends. She asked strategic questions that helped her understand the timeline of events and the names of potential witnesses. More importantly, she learned about the system of intimidation and retaliation that Blackwood used to silence his victims and protect himself from accountability. Armed with this new information, Sarah began the delicate process of reaching out to other women who had served under Blackwood's command. She used her intelligence training to make contact in ways that couldn't be traced back to an official investigation. Sometimes it was a chance encounter at the commissary. Other times it was a carefully orchestrated meeting at off-base locations. Each conversation revealed new details about Blackwood's systematic abuse of power. The evidence was damning, but Sarah knew that accumulating testimony alone wouldn't be enough to bring down someone with Blackwood's rank and connections. She needed documentation, official records, and physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That meant she would have to take significant personal and professional risks to gather the proof she needed. Using her access to classified files and intelligence databases, Sarah began constructing a comprehensive timeline of Blackwood's career. She cross-referenced his assignments with patterns of female officer departures, negative evaluations, and disciplinary actions. She obtained copies of personnel files, performance reviews, and transfer requests that painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination and abuse. The most damaging evidence came from Blackwood's own files. Sarah discovered that he had been keeping detailed notes about female officers under his command, including inappropriate comments about their physical appearance, their emotional stability, and their suitability for leadership roles. These notes, which were stored in his personal computer files rather than official military records, contained language that was clearly discriminatory and in some cases overtly sexual in nature. But gathering the evidence was only half the battle. Sarah knew that bringing down a general would require perfect timing, unassailable proof, and strategic allies who could help her navigate the complex politics of military justice. She couldn't afford to make a single mistake or give Blackwood any opportunity to cover his tracks or retaliate against her or the other women who had agreed to come forward. Sarah's plan began to take shape. She would need to build a case that was so comprehensive and well documented that it couldn't be ignored or dismissed by the military hierarchy. She would need to identify the right moment to strike, when Blackwood was vulnerable and unable to use his influence to escape accountability. And she would need to ensure that her investigation remained completely secret until she was ready to bring everything into the light. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that the skills Blackwood had tried to humiliate her for attention to detail, precision, and strategic thinking were exactly the skills she was now using to build the case against him. Every document she gathered, every witness she interviewed, every piece of evidence she compiled was done with the meticulous care of someone who understood that failure meant not just personal defeat, but the continuation of a system that would continue to harm other women who dared to seek advancement in military service. As the months passed, Sarah maintained her normal duties, while secretly building what would become the most comprehensive case of military misconduct in the base's history. She worked late into the nights, carefully organizing evidence and planning her approach. She established secure communication channels with witnesses and developed contingency plans in case her investigation was discovered before she was ready to proceed. The transformation in Sarah during this period was remarkable. The humiliation and anger from the briefing room incident had crystallized into something far more powerful. A cold, patient determination to ensure that justice would be served. She had learned to channel her emotions into strategic thinking, using her pain as motivation while never allowing it to cloud her judgment or compromise her professionalism. By the time Sarah was ready to move to the final phase of her plan, she had assembled a case that included testimony from 12 female officers, documented evidence of systematic discrimination spanning 5 years, and proof of deliberate abuse of power that violated both military regulations and federal law. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Blackwood's most powerful allies would be unable to protect him once it became public. But Sarah understood that having evidence was different from successfully using it. The final phase of her mission would require perfect execution, precise timing, and the kind of strategic brilliance that would ensure not just Blackwood's downfall, but fundamental changes to the system that had allowed his abuse to continue unchecked for so long. The water had long since dried from her uniform, but the memory of that humiliation continued to drive every decision Sarah made. Soon, very soon, it would be General Blackwood's turn to experience the consequences of his actions. And unlike the arbitrary and cruel punishment he had inflicted on her, the justice that Sarah was preparing to deliver would be both measured and devastating in its precision. Number: the single strike that changed everything. 6 months after the briefing room incident, Colonel Sarah Martinez sat in her office reviewing the final details of what would become known as Operation Clean Slate. The irony of the name wasn't lost on her. She was about to wipe clean years of corruption and abuse with a single, perfectly executed strike that would demonstrate the true meaning of precision and attention to detail. The opportunity Sarah had been waiting for finally presented itself when General Blackwood was selected to represent Fort Harrison at the annual Pentagon Leadership Conference. This prestigious event would bring together the highest-ranking military officials from across all branches of service, along with senior Defense Department officials and members of Congress. More importantly, the conference would be covered extensively by military and civilian media, meaning that any scandal emerging during the event would receive maximum exposure. Sarah had learned through her intelligence contacts that Blackwood was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on leadership excellence in the modern military. The speech was intended to position him for promotion to a position at the Pentagon, a move that would give him even greater power and influence over military policy. For Sarah, this represented both the perfect target and the perfect timing for her carefully planned strike. The week before the conference, Sarah made her move with the precision of a master strategist executing a complex military operation. She had spent months identifying the right allies within the military justice system, officers with impeccable reputations and unquestionable integrity who would be unable to ignore the evidence she had compiled, regardless of Blackwood's rank or connections. Her first contact was Colonel James Richardson, the base's Inspector General, whose reputation for fairness and thoroughness was legendary throughout the military. Sarah presented him with a preliminary summary of her findings, including just enough evidence to demonstrate the seriousness of her allegations without revealing the full scope of her investigation. Richardson's reaction was exactly what Sarah had hoped for: professional shock followed by immediate demands for complete disclosure. "Colonel Martinez," Richardson said after reviewing the initial evidence, "what you're showing me represents potential violations of military law that cannot be ignored, regardless of who is involved. I need you to present everything you have discovered to my office immediately." Sarah had been prepared for this moment. She provided Richardson with comprehensive documentation of Blackwood's pattern of discrimination and abuse, including witness statements, personnel records, and the damaging personal files she had discovered on his computer. The evidence was so extensive and well-organized that Richardson's team required an entire weekend to review all the materials. Meanwhile, Sarah simultaneously reached out to investigative journalist Amanda Chen from Military Affairs Weekly, a publication known for its rigorous reporting on military misconduct and corruption. Sarah had researched Chen extensively and knew that she was someone who could be trusted to handle sensitive information responsibly while ensuring maximum impact for the story. "I need you to understand," Sarah told Chen during their first phone conversation. "This isn't just about one general's abuse of power. This is about a systemic problem that has been allowed to continue because the military justice system has failed to protect the people who serve within it. The evidence I can provide you will demonstrate that failure in ways that cannot be ignored or covered up." Chen agreed to meet with Sarah and review the evidence, understanding that she was being offered exclusive access to a story that could have far-reaching implications for military leadership and policy. When she saw the comprehensive documentation that Sarah had assembled, she immediately recognized both the importance of the story and the credibility of the source. "This is Pulitzer Prize material," Chen told Sarah after spending hours reviewing the evidence. "But I need you to understand the risks you're taking by coming forward. Even with ironclad evidence, challenging someone at Blackwood's level could destroy your career." Sarah's response was immediate and unwavering. "My career was already destroyed the moment that man decided to humiliate me in front of my colleagues. The difference is that now I have the power to ensure that his actions have consequences, not just for me, but for every woman he has abused, and every woman who might face similar treatment in the future." The timing of Sarah's coordinated strike was flawless. On Monday morning, as General Blackwood was preparing for his departure to the Pentagon conference, Colonel Richardson formally initiated an official investigation into allegations of systematic discrimination and abuse of power. The investigation was launched with the full authority of the Inspector General's office, making it impossible for Blackwood or his allies to suppress or redirect. Simultaneously, Amanda Chen's explosive investigation was published in Military Affairs Weekly, complete with detailed documentation of Blackwood's misconduct and testimony from multiple victims. The article, titled "The General's War Against Women: Inside the Systematic Abuse at Fort Harrison," sent shockwaves throughout the military community and beyond. But Sarah's masterstroke was yet to come. She had learned that Blackwood's keynote address was scheduled to be broadcast live on military television networks, reaching thousands of service members around the world. Working with Chen and using her intelligence contacts, Sarah ensured that news of the investigation and the published exposé would break just hours before Blackwood was scheduled to take the stage. The result was a public relations disaster of epic proportions. As news of the investigation spread through social media and military communications networks, Blackwood found himself facing a hostile audience of military leaders who had just learned about his documented pattern of abusing female officers. The speech that was supposed to launch his promotion to the Pentagon instead became the final act of his military career. Sarah watched the live broadcast from her office at Fort Harrison, surrounded by colleagues who had remained silent during her humiliation, but were now eager to distance themselves from Blackwood's downfall. As the general approached the podium, unaware that his career was already over, Sarah felt a profound sense of vindication. Blackwood's speech lasted exactly 7 minutes before he was called off stage by senior Pentagon officials who had been monitoring the developing scandal. The cameras continued rolling as he was escorted away, capturing for posterity the moment when one of the military's most powerful officers realized that his abuse of power had finally caught up with him. The investigation that followed was swift and devastating. Within 2 weeks, Blackwood was stripped of his command and faced a court-martial on multiple charges, including abuse of power, discrimination, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The evidence Sarah had compiled was so comprehensive that his legal team advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than face a public trial that would only further expose his misconduct. General William Blackwood was dishonorably discharged from military service, forfeiting his pension and benefits after 30 years of service. More importantly, the scandal prompted a comprehensive review of military policies regarding discrimination and abuse, leading to significant reforms in how such complaints are investigated and resolved. For Sarah, the victory was both personal and professional. She was promoted to brigadier general within 6 months, becoming one of the youngest women ever to achieve that rank. But more significantly, her actions had created lasting change that would protect future generations of women serving in the military. The morning after Blackwood's discharge was announced, Sarah returned to the same briefing room where she had been humiliated 6 months earlier. This time, she was there to address the base's senior officers about new policies and procedures for preventing discrimination and abuse. As she stood at the front of the room, she remembered the feeling of cold water dripping from her uniform and the silence of colleagues who had failed to defend her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and confident, "today we begin implementing new standards for leadership excellence that will ensure every member of our military family is treated with dignity and respect. These changes are not suggestions. They are requirements that will be enforced at every level of command." The officers in the room listened attentively, many of them the same people who had witnessed her humiliation and done nothing to intervene. Now they understood that Sarah Martinez was someone who possessed not just the courage to stand up to abuse, but the strategic intelligence to ensure that justice was served completely and effectively. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she noticed a new pitcher of water on the conference table. For a moment, the memory of that terrible day flashed through her mind. Then she smiled, picked up the pitcher, and poured herself a glass of water with steady hands. "Any questions?" she asked, taking a sip and looking out at the assembled officers. The room remained respectfully silent. But this time, the silence carried a very different meaning. It was the silence of recognition that they were in the presence of someone who had demonstrated the true meaning of military excellence: the courage to fight for justice, the intelligence to plan strategically, and the perseverance to see a mission through to successful completion. General William Blackwood had intended to teach Colonel Sarah Martinez a lesson about precision and attention to detail. Instead, she had taught him and the entire military establishment a far more important lesson about the consequences of abusing power and the strength of those who refuse to be silently victimized. The water had dried long ago, but the impact of Sarah's single, perfectly executed strike would be felt throughout the military for generations to come. She had proven that sometimes the most devastating victories are achieved not through brute force, but through patient preparation, strategic thinking, and the unwavering commitment to justice that defines true military leadership. In the end, General Blackwood discovered that there are some battles that cannot be won through intimidation or abuse of authority. When faced with an opponent who possesses both the courage to fight and the intelligence to fight smart, even the most powerful bullies will find themselves defeated by their own actions and brought to justice by the very people they sought to destroy. Sarah Martinez had learned the lesson that General Blackwood tried to teach her about precision and attention to detail. She had learned it so well that she used those very qualities to end his career and transform the military justice system forever. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply being better than your enemy ever imagined possible.